good base of procedural and object-oriented PHP. It follows one of the most known design patterns, which is the Model View Controller Framework, so MVC. Now, why should you use a framework? Frameworks such as Laravel, Symfony, and CodeIgniter are built on loads of packages that are already developed by other developers, but most importantly, they are also maintained by other developers. With the use of a framework, you don't need to think about configuration files, server providers, or pre-described directory structures. Over the last 2 years since I've started my channel, I've seen a lot of comments from developers saying that I'll build it in plain PHP. Why should I use a framework? And in all honesty, most companies that need a new website or platform probably won't pay the full price of you creating a complete new system from scratch. Most e-commerces or PHP agencies use some kind of framework where they build upon. I usually respond to people that it depends on what you want to achieve. Do you want to be a freelancer? Go with PHP and build a framework from scratch if you want to. Do you want to work for an agency? Chances are that you'll probably never build a PHP framework from scratch. If we just think about frameworks in general, most developers will say that the increase of speed compared to a normal language is the biggest advantage. At its own core, Laravel is all about equipping and enabling developers. Their goal is to provide clear, simple, and beautiful code and features that help developers quickly to learn, start, and develop. Next to speed, Laravel's goal is to make developers happy. That's pretty weird coming from a framework, so let me elaborate on that. Laravel's main focus is their learning curve. Once you understand PHP, it's super easy to adjust to Laravel. It has built their framework in a way that most of the standard or common tasks, such as database interactions, authentication, and emailing, are made simpler by their own components. Laravel's third main focus is convention over configuration, meaning that Laravel's default configuration will bring you quite far, since you don't need to redefine configurations. Finally, simplicity. If we think about some advanced topics in PHP such as dependency injection, mocking, data mapper patterns, and common query responsibilities, Laravel focuses on the simplest possible implementation of that. Think about a global function using facades, active records, and so on. These are all topics we will be covering in this course. Some of you guys might have been familiar with Laravel 8 and some of you might not. On the 8th of February in 2022, Laravel released their 9th version. A lot of developers think that so many changes have been made, but most of the changes were implemented in minor and major patches from Laravel 8. So let's talk about some of the biggest improvements that came out with Laravel 9. First off, their PHP version. Laravel 8 supports a minimum PHP version of 7.3, while Laravel 9 supports a minimum PHP version of 8.0. This is pretty important to know since Laravel 9 will be using the newest Symfony 6 framework, while Symfony 6 requires PHP 8. It's a small triangle between Laravel, Symfony, and PHP. Laravel 8 and even previous versions allowed developers to use the PHP artisan route list command inside the CLI. This command shows users the existing routes in the application with its associated HTTP method. If you have a lot of routes defined inside your application, it would have got pretty messy inside the controller. At the moment, you'll see a pretty clear overview with the HTTP method, the endpoint, the named route, and the associated controller. Finally, Laravel supports anonymous stop migration right now. When you created multiple migrations with the same class name in Laravel 8 when trying to recreate your database, you would run into some issues. Since Laravel 8.3.7, it allows you to create anonymous class migration files. And since Laravel 9, it's been implemented as the default behavior. There are multiple ways on how you can set up your Laravel project on a Mac. There might be a chance that a lot of you guys don't have Docker installed, so I'll be installing Valet in this video. In order to install Laravel, there are a couple tools that we need to install first. First, we need to make sure that we got Homebrew installed, because Homebrew allows us to install PHP through the command line interface. If you're not sure whether you have Homebrew installed or not, you can simply perform the brew, update, command inside the CLI. If we hit enter right now, you'll see that the command has not been found, which is called brew. If it has been installed, you'll see an update flying by, otherwise it will return a message, as we got right now, saying that the command has not been found. Now let's install Homebrew. Let's navigate back to the browser, and inside Google, let's search for something called Homebrew. Now we need the first link, which is brew.sh. Let's open it. And Homebrew is an open source package manager that allows you to install applications and software on a Mac through the command line interface. It's super simple and effective to use, and once you get an understanding of how it works, you'll see how much time it can save you. Now, on the official website of Homebrew, you'll find an install command right here, right under the text install Homebrew. This command needs to be performed inside the CLI to install Homebrew. So what we can do is click on the copy icon to the right, navigate back to Homebrew, paste the command that we just copied and hit enter. So let's make sure that we provide that. And if we hit enter, the installation process will start. So I'll cut this part out since it might take a couple minutes. Now, once the installation process is done, you can simply write down clear to clear up your terminal. And we're ready to install our first software package, which is PHP. There are tons of ways on how you can install PHP on your Mac, but installing it through Brew is probably the easiest and effective way. Now, in order to install something through Brew, we need to write down the keyword Brew. Then we need to add a space, followed with the keyword install or even uninstall if you want to uninstall something. Now, right after install, we need to make sure that we tell Brew what we would like to install. In our case, it will be PHP. Let's hit enter. And this might take a minute again, so I'll cut this part out as well. So pause the video and I'll see you back in a second. Once the installation is done, let's write down clear to clear our terminal one more time. You can double check your PHP version, which is also a confirmation whether PHP has been installed correctly or not. For that, you can perform the PHP space -v command, which is a flag which stands for version. Let's hit enter. And as you could see, Brew returned a message saying that PHP 8.1.3 has been installed on our local machine. The next step is making sure that we install Laravel Valet, but that can't be done through Brew. We need to make sure that we install a package manager for it called Composer. You can either go to the browser and download it from their official website, but why should we since we already got Brew installed? Inside the CLI, let's perform Brew, install, Composer. I've already got Brew installed, so it's updating it for me, and it's downloading packages that are missing. Now, if you want to double check whether your installation went smoothly again, you can simply say Composer space -v to check the version. As you could see, Composer has been installed, and at the top, you can see that version 2.2.7 has been installed on our local machine. Now, what we need to do next is add in Composer's vendor bin directory to our global path on our local machine. This needs to be done inside the bashrc file of our root directory. So at the moment, I'm located in the root of my directory, which you can access by writing down cd and hit enter. And in here, let's say nano space. The bashrc file is a hidden file, so we need to add a punctuation mark, bashrc. Let's hit enter. Based on what you've done before, you'll find none, one, or even a couple exports defined right here. So what we need to do is to go to the bottom and define a new export. So let's say export, path, which is equal to a set of double quotes. Inside the double quotes, we got to start off by saying, well, our $home, /.composer, /vendor, /bin, colon, variable, path. Now to exit our bashrc, we need to press Ctrl X. It's asking us if we want to save it. Let's say Y and hit enter. Now that we have Composer set up, let's make sure that we install Laravel Valet through Composer. In order to add packages through Composer, you're not going to perform Brew but the Composer command. Then we're going to tell Composer that we want to install something globally, space, require, a package called Laravel /Valet. Let's hit enter. Usually, you run local host projects through your local IP address, which is 127.0.0.1. With the DNS mask that we just added, we could add a name to it. And this can be tested out by pinging any .test endpoint we got on our local machine. So what we can say is, well, ping Laravel app.test. If we hit enter, you'll see that it is pinging our local host. Now let's close it off. But what this is basically telling us is that our DNS mask has been set up correctly, since it's pinging our local host. There might be a chance that this isn't working for you at the moment, but I recommend you to restart your computer when that happens, since there might be an application on your local machine with a port 80 open, which is needed for Laravel Valet. Once you restart it, Nginx will be running on port 80. We need to make sure that we set up our database as well, since Laravel applications pull data from a database. Laravel itself recommends using DB Engine, which is a free all-in-one database management tool that includes MySQL, Postgres, and Redis. Keep in mind that this part is optional. If you prefer to work with another MySQL server, that's completely fine. I'm just showing you what Laravel itself recommends. But every other tool that allows you to interact with a MySQL database is fine. Now let's navigate back to the browser and let's open a new tab and let's search for DBNGIN, which stands for Database Engine. It's the first one that we need, which is an all-in-one database version management tool. Now let's click on the download button for a Mac. Let's save it on our desktop. And once it's done, let's open it. Let's pull our database engine inside our applications and let's open it. You can click on the button in the top right corner with the plus icon to create a new database server. Now for this course, we won't be using Postgres, but we will be using MySQL. Let's keep the latest version. Let's give our database a name of, let's say, Laravel app. Let's give a port of 3306, which is the port MySQL uses. And once we save it or create it, we will be navigated back to the overview, where by default, the server is turned off. And once you want to start your server, you can just click on the start button. I won't be doing it because I'll be using a database client inside MySQL in the next video, which is a little bit easier for people that watch my videos, so I don't need to switch screens every time. We got everything set up that we need. So let's create our first Laravel application inside the CLI. Let's navigate back. Let's write down clear. I personally store my coding related projects in a folder on my desktop. Let me show it to you. Called Workspace. This gives me a clearer overview than storing projects on multiple places on my computer. If you want to do the same thing, go ahead. If you like to store your projects somewhere else, that's fine as well. What we're going to do is creating our Laravel application right now. Now inside the CLI, we need to make sure that we change directories to our workspace folder. That can be done by saying cd into desktop. If I hit tab, you will see an autocomplete. Then we need to say, well, we want to go inside a folder inside our desktop called Workspace. If we hit enter, you can see that the left part of our terminal has been changed to Desktop Workspace. Now you can list all folders and files that we have saved right here by saying ls. And right here, you'll see a couple of folders or projects that I have running. Like I've said in the beginning of this course, you can install Laravel on multiple ways. The first one is through Laravel Global Installer. We got Composer installed globally, but we haven't installed the Laravel Installer tool. So let's do that first. Let's say Composer Global require, double quotes, inside the double quotes, a package called Laravel/installer. Let's hit enter. All right, it has been pulled in. With the Laravel installer that we just added, we could create a new Laravel project. So what we can say is Laravel, new, followed with a project name. So let's say Laravel app. What this command does is creating a new subdirectory called Laravel app and install a Laravel project inside of it. If we hit enter, this might take a couple seconds, so I'll cut this part out. If we perform another ls right here, you'll see that our project called Laravel app has been created successfully. Now let's make sure that we change directories inside our project by saying cd Laravel app. In here, we can perform another ls, which will show all files and folders that we have inside our Laravel app that has been created through the installer. We will not dive into the project structure in this video, but we definitely will be doing that in the next one. In order to check out our Laravel version, we need to perform a command through artisan, which you can see inside our directory as a file, right here. I won't dive into artisan yet, but we will be doing that later on. For now, just follow along. Now, whenever you want to perform a command through artisan, you have to start off with PHP, space artisan. We want to add a flag to it, so space --version. If we hit enter, you can see that our Laravel framework is using a version of 9.2 right now. There are two methods on how you could open your project in the browser through Laravel Valet. The first way is using the park command, and the second one is using the link command. We will be creating a new project through Composer in a second, so let me show you how you could use the park command to start your project with the Laravel installer. And in a couple minutes, I'll show you how you can run your project in the browser with the link command. The park command registers the Laravel app directory we're located in right now. It will basically get parked with Laravel Valet, and it is accessible through the browser with a folder name .test. So let's make sure that we're inside our Laravel app folder, and right here, perform the valet park command. If we hit enter, it's asking us for a password, so let's add it. As you could see, Laravel returned a message saying that the directory has been added to Valet's path. Let's navigate back to the browser, and let's replace our URI with Laravel app.test. And here we go. Our Laravel project is visible inside the browser. Now let's navigate back for a second and let's install a Laravel project through Composer. At the moment, we're inside our Laravel app, so we need to go back one directory by saying cd space ... Now we've changed directories back inside our workspace directory, as you could see. Right here, let's say rm to remove something. We're going to add a flag right here called space -rf. The R means recursive, which you have to use when removing an entire folder. The F stands for force. So we're going to force remove a folder called Laravel app. Hit enter. All right, let's perform another ls right here, and you won't be seeing the Laravel app that we have. With the installation of Composer, it has pulled in a feature called Create Project, which allows you to create new projects with a particular skeleton. So let's say Composer space create-project. We're going to tell Composer what we want to install. In our case, we're going to install a Laravel /Laravel project, which accepts another argument, which is the last one, since we need to define the subdirectory name. Once again, let's name it Laravel app. Just like the Laravel installer tool, this will create a subdirectory of the Laravel app directory with a skeleton Laravel project. It's installing it right now, and I think it's done. All right. Let's change directories back into our Laravel project by saying cd Laravel app. Now let's check the version number again by saying php artisan --version. And as you can see, this has installed a Laravel project of version 9.2 again. We're not going to use the park command to run our project inside the browser, but we will be using valet link. So let's write down valet link. And this command is pretty useful when you want to serve one single project through the browser. If we hit enter, add our password, you'll see that a symbolic link has been created. As you can see, it's saying that the message is saying that a symbolic link has been created of Laravel app. So basically Laravel app.test. If we navigate back to the browser, refresh our endpoint. And as you could see, even though we removed our first project, the endpoint still works because the folder name is still Laravel app. Now that we have set up our first Laravel project, we got to make sure that we use an editor that we'd like to write code in. Personally, I like to use either PHP Storm or Visual Studio Code when it comes to PHP code. And since PHP Storm is quite expensive and you don't have that many add-ons, I decided to make a video on adding the right extensions in Visual Studio Code. Now, whenever you want to install Visual Studio Code, you have to obviously open a new tab and go to code.visualstudio.com. We're located on the official website of Visual Studio Code, and based on the operating system that you're using, you'll see a download button with different text on it. I'm currently on a Mac, and Visual Studio Code recognizes that. That's why it's saying download for Mac. If you're on a Windows, it will probably say something along the lines of download for Windows. What I'd like you to do is download Visual Studio Code and open the Laravel app that we created in the previous video. Pause the video, and I'll see you back once you're done. For most of the extensions that we will be adding in this video, I'll demonstrate some of the features it provides to actually show you what it does. I have deleted all my PHP or Laravel related extensions and I want to download it all together. So let's do that right now. The first extension that I want to install is actually not related to PHP, since I want to update my theme. Currently, we're working with Visual Studio Code, its default theme. When you want to add a new extension, you have to click on the 4 squares in the left panel right here. This will open a new sidebar next to it, which will be the extensions marketplace. So whenever you want to install an extension, you just have to search for it. Now the first extension that I want to add is called Community Material Theme. It's the first one. It has close to 1 million downloads. So let's install it. Now once that's done, you'll see a drop-down popping up with all the different themes. Pause the video, go over the themes and choose the one you like. I try to change it up every single time I create a new course. So for this course, I want to use Community Material Theme, Pale Night High Contrast. So let's hit enter. And as you can see, we have updated our theme. The second extension that I want to add right now is called Laravel Artisan. It's an extension that has been created by Ryan Naddy, and it allows us to perform some artisan commands within Visual Studio Code inside the CLI. So let's hit install. There's no need to follow along, just watch and see what it does. Now let me actually open the command line interface by going to terminal and clicking on new terminal. And what we can do right here is basically say PHP artisan route list, which will show all available routes inside our project. And what the extension that we added allows us to do is first pressing Command Shift P, search for route, and you'll see an option right here called route list. Let's click on it, and right here, it has opened a new tab with all available routes inside our application. Next to that, let's perform it one more time, say artisan. You'll see all the other commands that it allows us to do through the Laravel Artisan extension that we just added. The third extension that we're going to add starts with Laravel, but it's the third one in the list called Laravel Blade Snippets, which has been created by Winnie. Now let's click on install. Alright. Laravel uses Blade for their front-end part, and this extension allows you to create snippets the same way as HTML snippets. If we navigate back to the project directory, open the resources folder, views folder, you'll find a welcome.blade.php file. Let's open it for a second and scroll to the bottom. Alright, somewhere inside our body, let's say right here. Within Blade, which is the file extension for views, you got some methods that you could perform. And one of them is yielding content. Instead of saying, well, add yield, parentheses, you could simply say, well, I have a yield, hit enter, and our yield has been created with a parameter inside the yield method. Whenever you want to print out variables from the controller inside your view, you have to wrap it inside a double set of curly braces, just like this. As you can see, it's not adding extra spaces inside the curly braces. If we write down variable name right now, you'll see that it can kind of be clustered. And this is actually something that's bothering me. Now there's an extension in Visual Studio Code. Let's go to the extensions market called Laravel Blade Spacer. What this will do is simply adding spaces around your Blade snippets. So it's the first one created by Austin Cameron. Let's install it. Let's navigate back to our welcome.blade.php file. Let's remove our variable. If we add a double set of curly braces, it has added spaces to the left and to the right where we can add a variable called name in the middle, which looks a lot better than this. Right. Now let's remove our variable and let's add the next two extensions. The first one is called Laravel Extra IntelliSense. It's the first one created by Amir. Let's click on install. And let's also install IntelliSense for PHP. So let's search for PHP IntelliSense and you write it in a different way. So let's click on the first one created by Ben Milburn. Click on install. These extensions add auto-completion for things like routes, views, configuration files, Laravel mix, validation, the .env file, route middlewares, and a lot more. If we navigate back to our project directory and open the app folder at the top, HTTP folder, and the controllers folder, we've got a default controller.php file. Let's go right below our use statements and let's define a new method right here. So let's say public function test. Let's return a view method. Now what Laravel IntelliSense recognizes is that whenever we try to pass in a parameter, so let's say single quotes, it recognizes all the views available inside our app. So if we click on welcome, it will refer to the welcome.blade.php file that we have inside the views folder. Alright, let's remove our test method. Let's go back to the extensions market and let's install Laravel go to view. It's the first one created by Coding U. Install it. Now let's navigate back to our controller one more time. Let's actually undo what we just deleted, excuse me. Hover over the welcome parameter On a Mac, press down the Options button, and on Windows it will probably be Control-click. So let's click on it, and as you can see, we have just been redirected to the welcome.blade.php file. The same thing can be done for our controllers. So inside the extensions market, let's say Laravel. The name is a little bit different because we need to add a dash, go to dash controller. So the first one, created by Steph, click on install. And the most common place where you call controllers inside your application is inside the routes folder, web.php file. Now let's quickly define a route. So let's say a route : get. The endpoint is /, comma, brackets, controller, : class. And the method is index. All right, what it allows us to do is pretty much the same. Press the options button, click on controller. We have a redirected to the controller class. Now what we can do right now is delete our route because we won't be using it anymore. And let's also delete the test method. The next extension is one that I haven't really used a lot, but I'm hearing a lot of positive things about it. Let's open the extensions market and let's search for Laravel snippets. It's the first one, created by Winnie again. Click on install. What it allows you to do is use shortcuts to define broadcast, cache, routes, cookies, Eloquent, and way more. Let's open the web.php file. Write down RO, which stands for route, and another R, which will find the method redirect and resource. If we click on resource, you'll see that it auto-completed the entire route for us. Once again, let's delete the route. And let's move on to the next extension, which is called Laravel go to components. It's the first one, well, the only option. Click on install. And this extension isn't actually an easy one to show you right now because we're not working with components. And it pretty much does the same thing as the previous go-to extensions. But this will go to the components rather than the view. There are also some PHP extensions that we can add. So right inside of the search bar, let's search for PHP. Most of you will have these PHP extensions installed, so I want to quickly go over them. The first one is the PHP doc block created by Neil Brayfield. Click on install. As the name implies, it creates doc blocks for your parameters. Let's also search for PHP doc comment created by Rex and install it, which will do basically the same thing for functions, variables, and classes. We have PHP namespace resolver, which is a key extension that you need to have, created by Mahedi Hassan. And what this allows you to do is to import missing namespaces. Now these were the PHP extensions that we needed for Laravel. Let's focus on some additional extensions that are not necessarily needed, but definitely good to have. The first one is called Beautify, created by HookieQR. Let's install it. And this is probably a package with the most amount of downloads I've ever seen in Visual Studio Code, since it has over 8 million downloads. Visual Studio Code has JavaScript Beautify installed by default, but there are some features missing here and there. This extension is pretty much the same extension, but on steroids. With Laravel, you'll be using the .env file quite a lot, so let's add an extension that will add colors, auto-completions, and so on to your .env file. The name of it is .env. It's the first one, created by Mike Stead. Install it. Now, once you start working with APIs, you'll be using JSON quite a lot. So let's search for paste JSON as code, created by QuickType. Let's install it. Now, this extension is pretty key since JSON code can be messy at times, especially when working with quite a lot of data. I will also be using Tailwind for this course because it's incredible and easy to integrate with Laravel. The downside of Tailwind is the fact that it has thousands of classes that you need to use. There is an extension that will fix that for you called Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. It's the first one, created by Tailwind itself. Let's click on install. What this extension will do is showing you auto-completion, syntax highlighting, and linting when it comes to Tailwind. At the moment, our folder structure has no icons, which is kind of bothering me. If we search for great icons, you will find a complete list of new icon themes that you could use. This does not affect your code, just choose something you're comfortable with. Personally, I really like using VS Code Create Icons, which is the first one that has been created by Emmanuel Biziat. Let's click on install. Let's enable it by clicking on VS Code Create Icons. Let's navigate back to our project directory. And as you can see, Folders have their own little icon, and even the files. Blade has an icon, the routes have an icon, the .env has an icon, GitHub, and way more. The last extension that we can use has nothing to do with PHP, but it's called Database Client. It's the first one, created by Siwon. Click on Install. This extension basically adds an interface where you can get access to your database. You can perform queries, delete rows, and a lot of more stuff related to database management. It also supports a lot of different types of databases, such as MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, Redis, and Elasticsearch. Before we continue on, let's actually quickly set it up. Once you have installed the extension, you will see a new icon added to your left panel, right below your extensions market, called Database. And the icon looks like a database as well. Let's click on it. As you could see, we don't have a connection defined. So let's do that quickly. In the top right corner of your database client, you'll see some icons right here. Let's click on the plus sign to create a new connection. And let me actually close off the terminal. All right. Right here, you will see an interface that is pretty new, but the labels and input fields might not. These are pretty standard when you want to connect to your database. The host, username, and port have been defined. I don't have a password defined for MySQL. If you do, just add it right here. What we can do right now is click on Connect. A message popped up saying connection success. And if we take a look at the left panel, you'll see all my databases that I have defined on my local host. There are some extensions in Visual Studio Code that allows you to set up a debug bar in PHP. There is a package available in Laravel called PHP Debug Bar, which includes a service provider to register a debug bar in the browser. A developer called Barry van der Heuvel developed a package called Laravel Debug Bar, which allows you to quickly debug your application during development inside the browser. In this video, we will be setting it up and we will be testing out some powerful features of it. We've used the term packages a couple times in this course. And a package is simply a way of adding functionality to your Laravel application that another developer created for us. In the next video, we will be going over our project directory where I'll show you in depth what happens behind the scenes when you install a Laravel package. In most cases, a package will be added through the command line interface. Visual Studio Code has an integrated command line interface that you can open by opening the terminal tab at the top, where you have the option to create a new terminal. You can use this terminal. I'll be using my external terminal since I can make the text a little bit bigger. If I try to do that in Visual Studio Code, the code text will also grow, which is kind of annoying. So let me close it off. All right. In order to install Laravel's debug bar, you have to perform the composer require Barry vdh / Laravel-debug bar command. We're not done yet, since you don't want the debug bar to be visible once you deploy your Laravel application. You only want to see it in development mode. For that, you can add a flag to it called space --dev, which means that it's only visible in development mode. If we hit enter, it's pulling the package in right now. Alright, let's navigate back to the browser and let me close off Visual Studio Code. Let's refresh our Laravel app, and right at the bottom, you'll see that our debug bar has been added. Now let me zoom in. All right. Now let's go over all the tabs that have been added. The first one is Message. The Message tab is something special, since it will only load the facade from within your code. Once you want to log messages in your application, you have to register the facade inside the app.php file. So what you can do is navigate back to Visual Studio Code, project directory, and let me close off all the tabs. Open the config folder and let's go to the app.php file. It's registering the package that we'd like to use as a provider. So we need to scroll down to our provider. Where is it? Right here. So right above the auth service provider, let's add a new line where we're going to say, well, we have Barry vdh / debug bar / service provider class, comma. What we could do next is outputting messages inside our debug bar. So let's do that. Let's go back to our web.php file in the root of our directory inside our routes folder. And right above our return view welcome, we need to make sure that we send back a message before we render our view. where we need to write down debug bar. As you can see, we have a use statement right here. So if we hit enter, it will pull it in, colon. Now there are 4 types of messages that we can add. The first one is info, which accepts a string. So let's add single quotes inside the parentheses, where we can print out, let's say, info. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that info has been printed out with an eye icon of info. Now next to info, you can also print out errors. And what we need to do is replacing info with error. Save it, navigate back, refresh it. As you can see, the text is red with an X icon. We can also print out warnings. And once again, we need to replace error with warning. Save it, navigate back. You see an exclamation mark with a yellow text. And the last one is add message, which simply outputs a message. Let's test it out. And as you can see, info has been printed out again. Now the second tab is the timeline tab. And this is pretty fun to use when you want to track how long it takes for each request. And it also shows you how much time it takes to boot your application. So let me quickly show you an example. Let's navigate back to Visual Studio Code and let's replace add message with start measure. We got to pass in 2 strings inside the start measure method. So let's remove info and let's say woohoo, comma, another string. And let's say rendering our first message. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that our application has been booted in 13 milliseconds and just 4 seconds to load our message that we're printing out inside the start measure method. The next available tab is our exceptions logger, right here, where you can simply log exceptions to debug your application. So let's add one. Let's navigate back. Let's remove the entire debug bar. And right here, let's define a try, where we will throw a new exception of a string, let's say try message. And right after the closing curly brace, we need to add a catch, which accepts a parameter of exception $e. Then inside our catch, we can call our debug bar facade, colon, and chain the add exception method to it. Inside the add exception method, we're going to pass in our $e. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that our exception has one message where it's trying to perform the try message that we added. So try message exclamation mark. The view tabs will show you all templates that have been rendered. At the moment, it's one, which is the welcome.blades.php file. A pretty cool feature that the view tabs has is the fact that it also includes parameters. At the moment, we have none, so let's quickly define one. Let's navigate back to our code editor and let's remove our try catch. And let's create a new variable called $name, which is equal to code with diary. The view method accepts a second parameter, so let's add a comma. And what we want to pass in right here is an array, and let's hit enter. We're sending back a key value pair right here, where the key will be the name, while the value will be our variable name. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, click on our welcome.blade.php file, and right here you'll see that it has one parameter called name. Then we got our routes tab, which will show you everything that is related to the route that is being called. So we got our URI, which is a get method to the / endpoint. We have the middleware, we have the use statements, the namespace, prefix, where, and the line where our route is being called, which is the web.php file on line 19 to 25. The most important tab is probably the queries tab, where you will see the queries that are being performed on your route. One thing to keep in mind is the fact that it also shows you how long it takes for a query to be fully loaded, which is a pretty good thing for a developer because you can see whether it's too long or not. If it is, you can make adjustments inside your code since it will also take a long time in production. Now the models tab will show you all the associated models. At the moment, we obviously have none. Gate is a tab that we won't be using, but the sessions one is actually pretty important because it will show you the CSRF token. It will show you the previous route, which is, well, basically a Laravel app.test endpoint. You can see flash messages and your stack data. Now the request tab is also pretty useful since it will show you everything related to your request. Think about the endpoint, status code, text, and even the content type. Now on the right hand side, you will also find some icons which can be pretty useful. The first one is the route, which is the / endpoint with a get method. Then we got our memory usage, which will be 1 MB. The third one is the request duration, which is close to 28 milliseconds. We have our PHP version, which is 8.1.3. And the last one is the folder icon. Once you click on it, you'll see a pop-up where you will find all the previous endpoints that you have been performed inside this project. This can also be pretty useful once you start working with JavaScript, so you can get more information about the request. Now you can also click on the request, so let's do that, where you'll be redirected to the request tab with information about that specific request. Now if we navigate back to Visual Studio Code and close off all folders that we have, you'll see that there are quite some folders and files that we actually haven't talked about. Now this is a great starting point once you're new to Laravel, but you are free to do whatever you want inside a skeleton Laravel application. Let's walk through all files and folders and you'll see what goes on inside of them and behind the scenes of a user interface. The first folder is the app folder. Let's open it. This is where the core of your application will go. Think about your models, controllers, commands that you create through Artisan. Once you create stuff like form request and mailing from the command line interface, a new folder will be created inside the HTTP directory called forms where your request will be stored. Now the HTTP directory is the place where you store your new controllers, middlewares and requests from the browser. The second folder is the Bootstrap folder, which has nothing to do with the Bootstrap CSS framework, but it comes from bootstrapping the self-start process. In here, you will find one file called app.php, which is a file that will automatically load the classes to boot up the start of your application. We've also got the cache directory, which contains framework-generated files for performance optimization, such as the route and services cache files. Then we have the config folder, where you find all the configuration files. Every file that is located inside this folder uses the same structure. If we open the database.php file, you'll see that it starts off by returning an array, where our default database connection, right here, will be grabbed from the .env file, so the .env method, where it will search for a variable called db_connection. If that doesn't exist, it has a default value of MySQL. If we scroll down, you'll find a complete section with all database drivers that we can use. We got SQLite, MySQL, PGSQL, SQL Server, and this works pretty much in the same way as the database connection, where it will search for an environment variable, as you could see, let's say for the password, and it has a default value, which is the second parameter of empty. Now next to the config directory, we have our database directory, where you will find everything that's related to databases. We've got our factories, where you store factory classes that allow you to build fake data for your models. We've got the migration directory, where migrations are stored, which allows you to create a table inside your database. And we've got the cdis directory, where you will have cdir files that allows you to include dummy data to the database. Then we have our lang folder, which stores all of your application language files. At the moment, we only have English. Then we have our public directory, which is the main entry point of all requests coming in. The index.php file can be seen as the front controller that kicks off the bootstrapping process and routes all requests in the correct way. Besides that, you can store files that are open to the public. Think about images, style sheets, scripts, and so on. The resources directory consists of all files that are needed for other scripts. Think about your views, CSS files, and JavaScript. Then we have the routes folder, which speaks for itself because we can store all routes right here, but in separate files. Inside the API.php file, you'll store files that uses the route service provider that are placed inside the API middleware group. The channels.php file is the place where to register all your event broadcasting channels. The console.php file is the location where you define all your closure-based console commands. And finally, the web.php file, which we will be using most of the time inside this course because we will place all web routes right here. Now inside the storage folder, you'll find a couple other directories. The first one is the app directory, where you will store files that have been generated by your application. Think about PDFs that are created inside the checkout process. We've got the debug bar that we pulled in as a composer package, the framework directory where you store stuff like cache, and the logs directory that has a laravel.log file inside of it, which consists of all the logs that you have inside your current application. Once you create stuff like unit tests and integration tests, you'll store them inside the test directory. And the last directory that we have is the vendor directory. Once you install a dependency through Composer, it will be stored right here. If you are using Git right now or even later on, keep in mind that this file will be excluded from pushing to Git. The main reason why is simply because Composer is expected to run as a part of your deploy process on any server, meaning that once you try to deploy your project, you need to perform a Composer install. Now let's close it off. And the next file is the editor config. And this is basically a file for your text editor such as Visual Studio Code, which gives instructions about Laravel's coding standards. As you can see, it has an indent size of 4. It's defining the char set, for example, and even whether to trim or twill white spaces, which has been set to true. Inside a Laravel project, we will be using something which is called an environment variable quite a lot, which can be found inside the .env file. An environment variable is pretty strong because it can be used throughout your entire application. Also, another quick note, the .env file will not be pushed to Git since these are credentials for your own application. But the .env.example, on the other hand, is a template of the .env file that each environment should duplicate to create its own. Now this file will be pushed to Git. Then we have the Git attributes and the Git ignore, which are both Git configuration files. We have the style ci.yaml, which is a YAML file that has some configuration stuff inside of it. We've already touched on it, but Laravel uses a tool called Artisan that has a lot of built-in command line actions that we can perform to create files. That all goes through this Artisan file. We have our composer.json and composer.log file. Both of them are configuration files for Composer. The composer.json file is editable, while the composer.log, as the name implies, is not because it's locked. These files have a lot of information about PHP dependencies that are being used inside the project. Right inside of the require section right here, you'll see a package that we required in development mode, which is the Laravel debug bar, which is using a version of 3.6. Now the package.json file is pretty similar to the composer file, but it's used for front-end assets in the system. We'll be using a node manager called npm in the series, which is a JavaScript-based dependency. The phpunit.xml file is an XML file that contains configurations for phpunit, which is one of the most used Laravel tools for testing. The readme file is a Git-based markdown file, which we won't be needing. And finally, we have our webpack.mix.js file, which is an optional configuration file when working with Laravel Mix. You will basically define how your frontend should be compiled and processed. In the previous video, I've mentioned that the core settings of any Laravel application can be found inside the config folder. Right here, you will find stuff like broadcasting, cache, database connections, hashing, mailing, queues, and a lot more. If we open one, so let's say the service.php file, you will find the same structure in every configuration file. It will start off with a return statement, where it will return an array with key value pairs inside of it. Now each value inside this array is accessible by a config key. So every value that you see, so domain, secret, endpoint, token, key, secret, and region, are accessible by a configuration key where you need to pass in the file name, the key, so mailgun, postmark, ses, and the value, separated by dots. So let's access the .env variable of mailgun_domain. If we navigate to our routes folder at the bottom and open a web.php file, remove our variable name, and let's also remove the array that we're returning. Alright, go right above our return statement, where we're going to define the config method, which is used to access the config folder. Inside the config method, we need to add a set of single quotes, and as you can see, IntelliSense is already recognizing the values that we can access, but what we want to do is to go inside the services.php file, so let's say services. Then we need to make sure that we access mailgun, so we need to write down .mailgun, And you already see the 3 values where we can choose from: domain, endpoint, and secret. And what we want is the .domain. I actually forgot to wrap it inside a DD, so a die dump. So let's go right in front of config. Let's add DD, opening curly brace, go to the end and close it off. Save it. Let's navigate back to the browser, refresh it. And as you could see, the return value is null, and that's happening because mailgun domain has not been set inside the .env file. So let's open the service.php file one more time. Right after our .env value, we're going to add a default of test_mailgun. Save it. Let's navigate back, refresh it, and right here, you'll see that test_mailgun has been printed out. Now let's navigate back and let's undo what we just did. And let's also delete the DD inside our route. Now let's talk about the .env helper function we've been seeing quite a lot in here. Now the env method that you see right here is called a helper function, which will simply pull a value that has been passed inside of it from the .env file. Keep in mind that the key that we're seeing right here needs to be equal to the key inside the .env file. And it's also case sensitive. A best practice in Laravel, and actually in any other language, is to always define your .env variables in capitals. So let's open the .env file from the root of our directory. And right here, you will find quite some environment variables that are needed by the framework. So think about your database settings right here, your broadcast driver, your crash driver, your session driver, and way more. But if we search for an environment variable called mailgun_domain, you'll see that it does not exist. So most of the .env variables that are defined inside the config folder do not exist. Once you want to use it, you have to double check whether the name is inside the config folder or not. I won't go into all of these variables that we have right here, but I do want to point out 2 pretty important variables that every Laravel developer should be aware of. The first one is at the top, which is the app_key. Now the value of it is a hashed string, which is encrypted, and this is never empty. Once you clone a Laravel project from the internet, you will most likely have an empty app key, which means that your application will not be visible in the browser. So let's remove it, save it, and let's navigate back to Brave, refresh our page. As you could see, we've been prompted with an error message saying that no application encryption key has been specified. Once this happened to you, make sure that you go to the CLI, and inside the CLI, you perform the php artisan key::generate command. What Laravel will do for us is generating a new artisan key. If we hit enter, navigate back to the browser, refresh your endpoint, you'll see that our page is back up, and if we go to our code editor, you'll see that our app key has been set again. Now the second environment variable you should be aware of is the app_debug on the line below. As you could see from the value, we're dealing with a boolean. Once the value has been set to true, like it is right now, a user of your application will see debug errors. Once it has been set to false, they won't. This is great when working on local projects versus projects that have been in production. So let's test it out. Let's set it to false and let's delete our app key one more time. Save it and let's navigate back, refresh it. And a minute or 2 ago, Laravel threw an error message that the key wasn't set. Right now, you'll see that we've been hit with a 500 error code, which is a server error, but the error message has not been printed out. Let's navigate back to the code editor and undo what we just did, save it. And the last thing that I want to show you is using environment variables outside of your config folder, which pretty much works in the same way. Let's open the web.php file right above our return statement. Let's create a DD. Inside our DD, call the env method and simply pass in a string right here where we need to add the key of the value that we want to print out. In our case, let's say db_host. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that our local IP address has been printed out. Before we wrap up this video, let's navigate back to Visual Studio Code one more time. Let's remove our DD, save it. If you're familiar with MVC, you know that the controller has a couple key functionalities. The first one is the fact that it accepts HTTP requests from the user interface. Think about forms that needs to be submitted. It can also get the right data from the database. Think about user authentication. A user enters credentials inside input fields on the user interface, while a request will be done to check whether those credentials exist or not. It also handles input validation, to check whether an input field where numbers needs to be added are actual numbers. At the end of all those functionalities, it usually sends back a response to the user. In Laravel, it will pretty much work in the same exact way. The end user interacts with the controller by sending an HTTP request from the front end. Then the controller responds to that request by either persisting data to the database or retrieving data from the model. Once the data has been retrieved or persisted, the controller will send back data to the view, which will then be visible for the end user. Laravel comes with a pretty cool tool called Artisan, which can be used to run migrations, create users, database records, and a lot of other stuff. We don't need to create controllers manually anymore since we can use Artisan to create controllers for us. So let's test it out. Let's navigate to the CLI. Now let me write down clear. Alright. And if we perform the PHP Artisan command right here, you'll find a complete list of commands that you can perform inside the CLI. I'm not going to cover all these individually, but we will be using a lot of them throughout this course. If we scroll up to the make section right here, you'll find all PHP classes that you can create through Artisan. The one command that we need is the make control command right here, which will create a new controller class for us. The left hand side is the action that we need to perform, so make controller, while the right hand side is the description, so it will create a new controller class for us. So let's do that. Inside the CLI, let's say PHP Artisan. Then we need to say what we want to do. We want to make a controller, space. Before we hit enter, we got to make sure that we add our controller name. Keep in mind that this will also be the class name and the file name. In our case, let's call it posts controller. Let's hit enter. As you could see, Artisan responded back with a message saying that the controller has been created successfully. If we navigate back to Visual Studio Code, controllers are stored inside the app folder, HTTP folder, controllers folder, where you will find the postcontroller.php file. Right here, you will see a default PHP structure with the opening tag. It has a namespace and a use statement right here, which is the illuminate HTTP request. Use statements are always defined above the class. What you're basically saying inside a use statement is, well, we've got our request class, copy everything inside the class, so we can use it inside our controller class. At the moment, you'll see that our use statement has a lighter color than our namespace and our class right here. This means that it has been pulled in, but it's currently not being used. Finally, we got our class called postController, which is extending the default controller, as you could see right here, called controller. We have complete freedom to do whatever we want inside our controller, but in most cases, you will be creating methods right here, which will then return something back. This can be a string, view, or whatever you want. So let's define one. Let's say public function index. And a quick note, we're adding an access modifier of public right here, since we're going to use this class inside the web.php file to output it inside the browser. Therefore, we can't use a protected or private use statement, since those are only accessible inside our postController class. So let's return something inside our index method. Let's say return a simple string of this is the index method inside the postController. Keep in mind that you need to close it off with a semicolon. This does not magically show us the return statement inside the controller. What we need to do is creating a route that knows where to look for our index method. This can be done inside the routes.php folder where we have a web.php file. Let's open it. Laravel defines a default route for us, and I actually don't want to spend too much time going over it. So let's just remove it, since there is a better way of defining a route. Whenever you want to create a new route, you need to start off with a route facade. So let's write down route. It's already pulled in, as you could see. Where is it? Right here. Then we need to say colon, followed with the HTTP method we're trying to perform. In our case, we simply want to output something to the browser, which will be the get method. Now the get method accepts two parameters. The first one will be a string of our endpoint. So what our endpoint should be is a /block. Right outside of our route, let's add a comma and let's define a set of brackets. since we're going to pass in two values right here. The first one will be the associated controller with our /blog endpoint. In our case, it will be posts controller. Keep in mind that we need to pull in the use statement, otherwise it won't work. So let's hit enter. It is a class, so in order to make this work, we need to add a double colon, class. Then inside our array, we need to add a comma because we have a second value, which will be the method that we're trying to reach inside our post controller. Now in our case, in single quotes, it will be index. Let's save it, and let's navigate back to the browser. Let's change our endpoint to /blog. And as you could see, the index method inside the post controller has been printed out. Let me actually zoom in. All right. Now the term CRUD is very well used when it comes to Laravel. If we think about a basic blog that uses CRUD functionalities, we have the opportunity to first create a new blog. We can read information of one single blog post. We can update a specific blog post, and we can also delete a blog post. Those are the four primary operations that web applications most commonly provide on a controller. Those four CRUD operations do need to have methods inside the controller. Laravel has some conventions for all of those routes of a traditional CRUD controller, which is called a resource controller. It also allows you to generate one out of the box, with all methods defined inside of it. So what we can do is navigate back to Visual Studio Code. Let's delete our post controller for a second. Move it to the trash. All right. What we then can do is navigate back to the CLI. And inside the CLI, hit the arrow up because we're simply going to perform the same command, but we're going to add a new flag to it. So let's say space, double dash, and the flag is called resource. Let's hit enter. Our controller has been created successfully. So let's navigate back to Visual Studio Code and let's open our post controller. And as you could see, our controller has been pre-filled with some methods. Now let me show you what all those methods should be doing when we're talking about our blog example. So the index method should show all available posts. So every single one that we have inside of our database. Then we have our create method, which obviously creates a new post. We have our store method, and the store values come from the HTTP request, as you can see as a parameter. That's why you're seeing the request object as an argument. Then we have the show method, which will show one post based on the ID, as you could see once again inside the parameter. Then once a user submits the edit page, it will be handled inside the update method, which will grab the request and it will update one specific post. Finally, there's a destroy method, which will delete one row inside the database based on a given ID. Now let's navigate back to the index method at the top, right here. Let's remove the comment and let's quickly return a string of index of blog method. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh the endpoint, you'll see that index of blog method has been printed out. But this does not work for all methods we got defined. There is a command that I've showed you before that you can perform inside the CLI to show all routes available in your project. So inside the CLI, let's perform the PHP artisan route list command. Don't worry about all those routes that you're seeing right now. The one that we need is this one, which is a get method to our blog, which is using the post controller at index. So the index method inside the post controller. But we're missing all those other methods that we should have right here. So should we add them all manually inside the web.php file? Now there is actually a trick in Laravel to add all those methods right here. So what we can do is basically defining a new route. So let's say route, : Instead of giving it a get method, we can use the resource method right here. Now the first parameter will be the same as before, so blog. And keep in mind that the / is actually optional. I always forget saying that, so let's just try it out without one now. Then right after our endpoint, let's add a comma. Instead of defining an array, we're simply going to call the post controller, : class, which will grab all methods that we have defined inside the post controller and will chain it at the blog endpoint. So let's comment out the first route that we had, save it, navigate back to iterm, hit the arrow up and run the route list command one more time. Now right here, you will see that we have the index, store, create, show, update, destroy, and edit endpoints defined right after our / blog endpoint. Before I wrap up the video, I want to show you how you can easily return a view back to the browser. At the moment, let's open the post controller, we're returning a simple string, which is something that you will probably never do again. So let's remove the string. And what we can do right here is exactly the same as what we saw in the default route that Laravel added inside the web.php file, is returning the view method. Now inside the view method, we need to make sure that we return a string of the path. We haven't defined the view yet for our /blog endpoint, so let's open the resource folder, views folder, and let's create a new folder called blog. Then inside the blog folder, create a new file called index.blade.php. Now let's write down h1 here and hit tab. Let's add the text of index method of blogs. Then let's navigate back to the post controller one more time. The view method knows that it needs to look inside the resources folder, then inside the views folder, but it doesn't know that it needs to go inside the blog folder. So first, let's define blog right here, and you already see the option. Instead of adding a / to access the index.blade.php file, we need to add a punctuation mark, followed with the first path of our view. There's no need to add the .blade.php file extension. All we need to do is say, well, get me the blog folder .index file. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh your endpoint, you'll see that the index method of blogs has been printed out. There might be a chance inside your web application where you need a controller that only uses one single route. You should probably create a new method inside a controller where you simply return a view. If we change our endpoint to /, you'll see that we're getting a 404. And let me actually close off my debug bar. Alright. This means that the page has not been found. So let's define a new controller inside the CLI. Let's say PHP artisan make me a controller called home controller. Let's hit enter and let's navigate back to Visual Studio Code. Open the controllers folder and the home controller. It's kind of overkill to define a new method right here called public function index, and where we return a view to, let's say, index. We all know that PHP has some magic methods that you can define. We're all familiar with the most used one, which is the construct magic method. But you can also define the invoke method, which allows you to invoke an instance of a class. That instance will then treat it like a function and call it. So instead of defining the index method right here, let's delete it and let's define a new one. To do that, we simply need to start off with public function again. Then we need to add a double underscore invoke, where we will return a view to the index page. Keep in mind that you can use the invoke method just like any other method. You can define Eloquent queries, logic, and way more. So whenever you want to use one single method inside a controller, I recommend you to use the invoke method like we've done right now. So let's put this in work, since we do need to create the view and the route. So let's scroll down to the resources folder and let's remove the welcome.blade.php file. And inside the views folder, let's define a new file called index.blade.php. In here, let's create an h1 and let's say homepage brackets invoke or something. Save it, open the web.php file and let me add a comment where I will say that this is the route for the invoke method. Then on the line below, we need to make sure that we define the route, which can be done in the same exact way as defining a route for a resource. So let's say route, : Well, we're going to use a get method, The endpoint will be /. Then we don't need to add an array right here because we're simply going to call the controller, which will be home controller, : class. Save it. Let's navigate back to the browser. And as you could see, homepage invoke has been printed out. We've talked about routes a little bit in the controllers episode, and we've only talked about the getRoute method since this is the most common one. Let's navigate back to the web.php file right here, and let's remove this comment block that we have. Next to the getRoute method, Laravel provides 6 more options that you could use. We obviously got the getRoute, which will be used to either get a resource or multiple. So it will request a resource. And excuse me, typing and talking is pretty difficult. Then we got the second most common HTTP method, which is the post method. And the post method is mainly used whenever you want to create a new resource. So simply a new row inside your database. Then we got the put method, which is used whenever you want to update a resource. We've got the patch method, which is used to modify a resource. Wait, why do put and patch perform the same operation? With the put request, you're going to modify every single value inside that single row, while the patch method only modifies the values that have been changed. Then we got the delete method, and as the name implies, this will delete a resource, so a single row. Finally, we got the options method, which will ask the server which verbs are allowed at a given URI. And this is actually not one that we will be using, but it's good to know that it does exist. Now I've got a route defined right here that I commented out, which will get one single resource. And let's actually comment out the resource route that I have as well. Whenever you want to grab all blocks from the database, you will be performing the GET request to the /block endpoint. So GET request. But when it comes to blog posts, you also want to show a user one single post, right? A user can click on a post in a complete list of posts where information about a specific post is visible. So let's duplicate our route. And whenever you want to request one specific post, you need to request the blog / a unique value that represents that specific post. In our case, let's just say 1. So we're accessing one specific post where the ID is 1. Now this will not be visible inside the index method, but it will be inside the show method that shows information about one specific post. Now let's duplicate this line 2 more times. So where we're going to perform the post request. The first one is the GET request, obviously, which will show the /blog /create page. So the actual form for the user. And that's a typo, excuse me, inside the show method. Now the create method will be visible inside the create method inside our controller. And once a user submits the form where the input fields have been entered, it will be redirected to the /blog endpoint. But we're not going to perform a GET request, but a POST request inside the store method. So it will be stored inside the database. Now the same format needs to be performed, so let's copy paste it, when you want to update something. So either a put or patch. First, we need to get one single post to the /blog /edit / the specific ID. In our case, it's 1 for now. And we're going to call the edit method. Then we need to request the actual update, which will be done inside the patch method, where we are going to update once again one specific block, so /blog /1 inside the update method. Finally, we got our delete method, so let's copy this line. Let's say delete, which will have the HTTP method of delete. Once again, we're going to delete on one specific ID, where the method inside our post controller will be destroy. Now all these routes that I just defined right here will be handled inside the resource method. Now let's say that you've got a route that accesses multiple HTTP methods, so a post and a GET request. Laravel got 2 methods on how you can handle that. So let me add a new comment which says multiple HTTP verbs. The first one is calling our route. Instead of saying get or post, we're going to say match. The match accepts 3 parameters. The first one is an array, so brackets, where we need to define the HTTP verbs you'd like to check. So in single quotes, get, comma, post. Then we need to define our endpoint, so right after our array, /block, another parameter, because we need to define once again the controller, which will be post controller, colon class, comma, and the method will be index. Unlike the post, put, and patch, we can actually test this out inside the browser, but we do have to comment out all the other routes that we have for a second. So let's do that. Save it and let's navigate back to the browser. Go to our /blog endpoint, and as you can see, it's still visible. Let's undo what we just did. And let me show you the second method. So let's comment out our route. And what we can do is create another route, colon, And the HTTP verb that we're going to add is any. Now the any method accepts 2 parameters because we're not going to define HTTP verbs ourselves because it can be obviously any. So the endpoint is /blog, comma, the method is post controller, the controller is the post controller, colon class, and the method will be index. Save it, and let's actually comment it out one more time. Navigate back to the browser, refresh it, and it's still visible. Let's undo what we just did, and let's comment out this line. Before I wrap up the video, I want to show you the last method that you can use, and that's used whenever you don't need to look for a controller, but simply want to pass in a view. So let's define a new comment, where we're simply going to return a view. Then we're going to define a route, colon, and the method that we're going to use right here is the view method. Inside the view method, we need to pass in 2 required parameters, and the third one is optional. The first one is the URI, so let's say /blog, comma. Then we got to define the view without the extension. In our case, let's say blog.index. Let's save it. Let's navigate back to the browser, refresh it, and as you can see, the page is still visible. Like I've said, there is an additional parameter that you can pass in, which is an array of the data. So right after our view, let's add a comma, brackets, where we're going to define a key value pair. The key, in our case, will be name, while the value is code with Dari. Now let's open our index.blade.php file inside the blog folder, right below our h1, create blade snippets, and say $name. If we navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that code with Dari has been printed out. Now before I wrap up the video, let's clean up our code a little bit. First, we're going to remove our $name variable inside our index. Let's close it off. Now inside the web.php file, we're not going to use the view method, so let's comment it out. All right, and let's pull the resource route up to the top because we will be using that later on as well, and the invoke method as well. When it comes to CRUD applications, you don't want to define a static ID like we've done right now. What you do want to use right here is called a route parameter. So we're simply going to replace the ID of one that we have right here with a variable that can be changed based on the ID. Whenever you want to define a route parameter in Laravel, you got to obviously remove the static ID and replace it with a set of curly braces. Then inside the curly braces, you got the option to pass in a variable name. If I could give you a suggestion, keep this equal to the actual value you'll be expecting. If it's a name, write down name right here. If it's an ID, write down ID. What we will be doing is using the ID, so let's write down ID. Right now, we've told our get endpoint, so right here, that will show one specific post that it always needs to receive an ID. So let's change this up for the edit method, the patch method, and the delete method. If we try to test this out inside the browser right now, we will not receive anything, since we got nothing defined inside the show method of our post controller. So let's add that. Let's go to our post controller, scroll down to the show method. You'll see that by default, resource already defines the parameter, so $ID, and this variable ID will be the same one that we will be adding inside the URL. Now in order to test this out, let's return that specific ID, save it. Let's navigate back to the browser, and let's change our endpoint to /blog/1. You'll see that the variable ID that we have inside the URI, so 1, has been printed out inside the browser. If we change it to 10, so ID of 10, you'll see that 10 will be printed out. At the moment, we're saying that the ID is required whenever we want to show one single post to the end user. Let me quickly show that to you. We've already got our /blog defined, and let's change it to article for a second. Save it and let's navigate back to Chrome, change it to article. Now this works fine. But if we remove our 10, so our variable ID, you'll see that we're receiving a 404 and the page has not been found. This is good since the article endpoint has not been defined, but the article /ID is. Now Laravel allows us to make our route parameter optional, and it's super easy to do that. Let's navigate back to the web.php file, And in order to make it optional, we need to add a question mark right after our variable name. So in our case, it's ID, question mark. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh it, you'll see that we're receiving an error message because our show method does still accept a parameter. Whenever this happens to you, you should provide a default value inside the controller. What we can do is navigate back to the post controller, is that whenever the ID has not been provided, show a default value or a fallback ID of 1. If we save it and navigate back to Google Chrome, refresh it, you'll see that our fallback ID of 1 has been printed out. And if we change our endpoint to 100, you'll see that 100 overwrites the default ID of 1. In most cases, you won't be showing a fallback ID, but it's good to know that you actually can do that. So let's undo everything that we just created. Go to our web.php, change it to /blog, and remove the question mark. A pretty cool feature that Laravel offers is adding regex patterns for your route parameters. At the moment, we're telling our show route that the route parameter should be an ID, which is equal to a number. By adding a regular regex expression, we're going to tell our route that it should only match a particular pattern. For our ID, we got to tell that it only should accept numbers. In Laravel, this can be done with a method which is called method chaining. Method chaining is an interface that allows you to chain method calls, which eventually results in less code. In order to add method chaining, we got to go right after our closing parentheses of the show method, add a dash, followed with a greater than sign, where we got to define the method name that we would like to chain on our route. In our case, we're going to chain the where method. At the moment, we're receiving an error message because it accepts the name of the parameter with the expression. So let's start off with the parameter. In single quotes, we're going to say that our ID should be, so comma, another set of single quotes, a regex pattern of brackets. Inside the brackets, we're going to say number 0-9. And right after our closing bracket, we're going to add a plus. So it can be 10, 11, 12, and so on. If we save it and navigate back to the browser, refresh our endpoint, we get to make sure that we change article to blog. You'll see that 100 has been printed out, and this works fine. If we change it to, let's say, Dari, you'll see that we're getting an error message saying that the get method is not supported when adding a string as a route parameter. Now the same thing can be done for strings. So let's navigate back, and let's duplicate the line of code that we have, and let's comment out the ID. Now for the duplicated route, let's change ID to name, where we're going to show the block endpoint where the name is equal to not 0-9, but capital A dash capital Z, the lower cases as well, so A-C. Now let me actually add this on the line below, which makes it a little bit easier to read. If we save it and navigate back, refresh it, you'll see that Dari is accepted, which is a string. And if we change it back to, let's say, 100, we're getting the same error message as before because an integer is not supported right here. We could even make it more advanced by passing in multiple parameters and regexes. So let's navigate back, let's copy this line and let's comment it out, and let's duplicate it on the line below. Right in front of our variable name, let's add a variable ID as well, so both of them, so block ID and then name. Let's remove everything that we have inside our where method, because we're going to define two regexes right here inside an array, so let's add brackets and hit enter. All right. Now, this will be a key value pair. The first one will be the ID, which has a value of a string, brackets, plus, and the value is 0-9. And the same thing needs to be done for our second parameter, which will be the name, which has a value of A-Z, A-Z. Save it. Let's navigate back to Google Chrome. Change our endpoint to /blog 1/Dari. You'll see that this works fine. And if we do it the other way, so Dari /1, you see that once again, we're receiving a 404 because the parameters do not match the regex. Laravel isn't Laravel if it hasn't defined helper methods for what we're doing right now, which makes your life a lot easier. Whenever you are dealing with a name or ID, Laravel defined a pretty cool helper that you can implement. So let's navigate back and let's comment out what we just did right here. And let's uncomment the first route that we defined, where the ID is a number. Let's remove the entire where method, where we're going to chain the where number method. Now the where number method will check whether it matches the regex we defined before. We do need to pass in a value right here, which is the name of our route parameter, which will be ID. Save it and let's navigate back. Our endpoint needs to be changed to /blog/1. This works fine. If we change it to Dari or Ari, you'll see that we're receiving the same error message. Now the same thing can be done for the name. So let's comment out this line again and uncomment the blog/name endpoint, where we're going to remove the where method and replace it with where alpha. And here we need to pass the route parameter name of name. Save it, let's navigate back, refresh it, and Ari has been printed out. Let's change it to a number, and we're once again getting the same error message. Finally, the power of method chaining comes in clutch right now for our last route. Let's navigate back, and let's comment out what we just copied, and uncomment the where clause where we have an ID. Remove the entire where clause actually, where we're going to chain the where number method first, which has the ID. Then on the line below, we can add another chain, which is the where alpha. And this needs to be the name. So let's add that. Save it. Once again, let's navigate back to the browser, refresh our endpoint to /10/Dari. You'll see that this works because it matches the pattern. And if we change it to Dari/10, we're getting a 404. Now Laravel offers a pretty amazing feature which is called named routes. If we navigate back to our code editor and open our index.blade.php file inside our blog folder, we all know that we can define an anchor where we need to add an href. So let's say that our href is /blog and the text is blog. What we're doing right here is adding a static link to our path, which can be terrible once you need to change up your routes in a later phase. The simplest way of making these routes dynamic inside your application is naming each route, which will then help you to refer to it without explicitly defining a static path. The first step that we need to perform is chaining the route method on our routes. So let's open the web.php file and let me actually clean this up a little bit. All right, we do need the blog ID and let's remove the where ID method as well. Now, if we start off with our first route, so our /blog endpoint, we could simply chain the name method to it, where we need to define a name for our route as a string. So let's add single quotes and let's say blog.index. All right, let's use our route inside our view. Let's return to our index.blades.php file and let's remove our static /blog. And let's also remove the double quotes. We will be focusing on Blade later on, but for now, let's add a double set of curly braces, and inside of it, we can use Laravel's global route method. The route method is something which is used quite a lot inside views to simplify linking to a named route. We need to tell our href, well, what route do we need to call right here? It's the one that we just defined, so inside our routes method, let's add single quotes, blog.index. If we save it, navigate back to Google Chrome, refresh our /blog endpoint, you'll see our new blog button, click on it, and we have been redirected to the /blog endpoint. This still doesn't showcase you the advantage of the named method. So let's navigate back to the web.php file, open the web.php file, and if we change our endpoint to /article instead of blog, save it, navigate back to our /endpoint, change our endpoint to /article, click on blog, you'll see that we have been redirected to /article again. Now what about our second route? So our /blog /id. Let's chain the name method to it. And we need to add a named route of blog.show. We've got a small issue right here because we're dealing with a route parameter. Now this can be handled inside our view. So let's open the index.blade.php file. And right after our blog.index, so our route name, add a comma. And we're going to pass in an array where we have a key value pair of ID is equal to 1. Now we're not done yet because we're not going to the block.indexNamed route, but to the block.show. If we save it and navigate to the browser, click on block, you'll see that we have been redirected to /block/1. Now let's change it up for all routes. So let's go to the web.php file. We've got our block.create, so let's change the name method where we have a route of block.create. The same thing needs to be done for the store method, so name block.store. So whenever we want to update it as well, so change the method, which is block.edit. We have the name of block.update and for the destroy as well. So let's say name block.destroy. Now if we save it and navigate back to the CLI, perform the php artisan route list command, you'll see that right in front of the controller and index method, we've got the route name defined. So block.index, store, create, edit, show, update, and destroy. Whenever you're working with a resource controller, you don't have to define route names for these methods. If we navigate back to the web.php file, and let's comment out all these routes, and let's uncomment our resource route, save it, let's navigate back to the terminal, hit the arrow up, run the command, you'll see that our named routes are still defined. If we navigate back to the browser, refresh your endpoint, you'll see that /block/1 is still defined. What the resource controller does is binding all of the routes with the appropriate method names on the specified controller. So let's navigate back to our web.php file one more time and undo what we just did. Save it, replace /article to /blog again. So a quick recap, whenever you are working in a Laravel application where you want to make the process of changing the URI easier, you could use named routes. Now looking at our routes right now, you'll see a clear pattern where they all start with /blog. These are named grouped routes. What we can do is structure it a little bit more to grouping them with a predefined prefix of blog. So let's start off by creating a new route right below our delete route called route : but instead of adding an HTTP verb, we're going to say prefix. Inside the prefix method, we got to define the prefix of all of our routes. As you could see, they all start with /blog. What our goal eventually is adding all the routes above inside the prefix route. That can be done by chaining a method to it called group. Inside the group method, we need to have a function callback, so function, parentheses, curly brace. Let's hit enter. All right. What we could do right now is simply placing all of the routes above inside our prefix method. So let's do that. So let's add these right here. Whoops, that went wrong. These two as well. These two as well. And the last one, so the delete one as well. Let me outline it a little bit. All right, let's delete all the comments. And let me make my sidebar a little bit smaller. Now keep in mind that whenever you want to remove block inside your grouped routes, you need to have the / route defined that represents the root of your blog page. So let's remove it and keep the /, but let's delete it for all the other routes. All right. And that's the last one. If we save it and navigate back to the CLI, perform the php artisan route list command, you see that the endpoint still starts with blog. It has a named route of blog.index, and it's calling the post controller @index method. If we navigate back to the browser, refresh our /blog endpoint, you'll see that this works fine. The last route type that I want to show you are fallback routes. There is a big chance that the user of your application tries to access a page that doesn't exist. If we change our endpoint to /about, you'll see that we're getting a 404 and the page has not been found. Whenever you implement a fallback route inside your application, it will overwrite the 404 page where you can add way more functionality than a 404 page itself. Fallback routes needs to be defined inside the web.php file, at the end of your routes file. So you can't place it right above your prefix method right here. So let's go to the bottom. Let's define a new route called fallback route, route : and the HTTP method that we're going to add right here is called fallback. You could return a function right here that prints out a simple message, or you could call a controller that will output data from the database. So let's look at an example. A user is trying to access a blog post that doesn't exist. Would you want to show him a static message, or would you rather show a page where you list all recent blog posts so that the user stays on your web page? Well, I think the second solution is the best. So let's define a new controller inside the CLI. So let's say PHP artisan make : controller called fallback controller. What we will be doing then is going inside the fallback method, where we will directly call our fallback controller. So let's say fallback controller, pull it in, : class. So we don't need to define the endpoint. What we will be doing inside our fallback controller, so let's open it, is defining the public function _invoke method, because we're simply going to use one method. Right here, we're going to return a view, first to fallback.index. We haven't defined it yet, so let's do that. Let's scroll down and inside the views folder, create a new folder called fallback. And inside the fallback folder, we're going to create a new file called index.blade.php. We're not going to do anything special here yet, but we will definitely do that in a later phase where we will be using Eloquent. Inside our index method, let's define an h1, where we're going to return a message of fallback page once a route doesn't exist. If we save it, navigate back to the browser and refresh our endpoint, you'll see that our custom fallback page has overridden the default 404 page, and fallback page once a route doesn't exist has been printed out.